it affects decision-making and critical thinking. So in a way, you're more susceptible. Anything that you're consuming online becomes real. And that ability to just kind of differentiate and say, is that real? Is that imagined? About how do you know that's true and how do you know that's not true? And one of the ways that we do it is we'll actually make, using AI, videos and say, that video looks real, but guess what? It's not.
So we tried to kind of all these tests. I retired. I mean, obviously, but thankfully.
All right, with me in the studio is Devika Mankani, Divisional Head and Chief Psychologist at Fortis Education and licensed psychologist. Devika, how are you?
I'm very well today, Maria. How are you?
Good. You are so busy, I'm sure, these past few weeks and this specific week as well, because it's a back-to-school season, yes. And I'm sure it's been crazy.
It's back-to-school day today. We actually went back to school today.
Yes.
And I tell you, the parents were happy, bringing in their children and saying to the school, you can have them.
Yes, exactly. Please educate our kids.
Please,
take them
do what you do so well, because we will never underestimate what you do as teachers.
Absolutely.
I always say that's one of the hardest and the most difficult professions ever.
Yes, I know. Yeah. I know. You're sort of like a parent. I mean, as a teacher, even if you don't have kids of your own, you're a parent to these kids. You're everything to them 5 days a week.
Yeah.
Half that day. So
yes,
it's insane. I mean, when you think about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell us a bit more about Fortis Education. This is new. Last time we never spoke about that. So can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so I wear a few different hats, and I have the privilege of working at Fortis Education. We have 2 schools, Sunmark School and Regent International School, and 10 nurseries, Jumeirah International Nurseries. The company was set up by my mother-in-law more than 45 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And I was actually a student at one of the nurseries. That's the first time I ever met her. We got along really well then as well. And she taught me, and my sister-in-law taught me. And it's a real legacy.
Wow.
Education is really the sort of family passion.
Yes.
And it's taken very seriously. We are a positive education school, which means character development and well-being is just as important as academic achievement.
I love that.
Yeah. And I mean, it's about time. It's really about time.
Yes.
The science now is right there. The science has proven that you just cannot have one without the other.
Yes.
If you have that community that focuses on well-being, then academic success follows. And at the same time, if you experience academic success, it feels good.
Yes.
Right? No one. I've never heard anyone say, "Well, you did really, really bad. You failed, but just try to feel good about it."
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So they go hand in hand, and developed by Martin Seligman and other researchers with him. The foundations are in positive psychology, which most people say, I didn't know that there was a negative psychology.
Right.
But positive psychology basically says, let's look at different facets of well-being and how we can enhance them and how we can promote flourishing versus just looking at what's going wrong and look at what actually makes, I guess, in a way, happy people happier and keeps them happy.
Right.
And there's lots and lots of research now. We're sort of 2 decades in the research on that, which is fascinating.
Yes.
And we'll have some tips coming up on that too.
Actually, today we're going to talk about, technology and how it's affecting human connection, and especially with the back-to-school season. I mean, we're also going to talk about how tech affects, attention, affects sleep, affects a child's brain development. And I know that we've heard this so many times, and I know so many studies have come up, and that's exactly what we're addressing today, because I feel like we demonize tech, but at the same time, we depend heavily on tech.
Right.
And I want to sort of discuss, that balance. I mean, it's not all bad, but at the same time, overdoing it can lead to consequences.
Right.
So first off, I just want to know, what do you think about all the tech, all the advancements that we have today?
Right.
Do you think they're good? Do you think they're bad? Do you think they're both?
Yeah, really, really bad. We should all go back to a cave.
Okay. Amazing. I'm going to quote you on that.
I watched a brilliant video. We have positive education teacher training led by my wonderful sister-in-law, Katrina. Okay. She's an expert in the field. And she runs a 3-day training for all our new teachers and continuing education. And one of the videos in one of the sections is amazing. It's about gratitude, but technology woven into that. And this man is talking about how people complain on flights about various things. And he says, how can you even complain? You're sitting in a seat, flying through the air without any effort.
Yeah.
You're served food. You can watch movies. You can even be on the internet these days. And people lose their cool when the internet goes off for 30 minutes on a 7-hour flight. And he's like, we have to shift the focus back to, in a way, what was it like before? And that enhances the gratitude that we should have, and the focus on how is this helping, right? And I always say there's the two questions. The first, and you have to ask them at the same time. The first is, what is technology doing to us? Because we know that there's things that we need to kind of integrate and work on. And then what can it do for us? Because if we don't look at both, then we're polarized, and then we just kind of become one of those no-techers. Right. And the no-techers are not happy either, because they're realizing that it's pretty hard to function in a no tech. So it used to be, it went from no tech to low tech, and now I think it's smart tech, but I say positive tech or intentional tech, which is just trying to find the pieces that fit for you. And my recipe wouldn't work in your house, and your recipe might not work in anyone else's house. But that means playing around with it, taking some risks. We've had some blow-ups at home around tech use, especially over the summer.
Of course.
And I know that almost every family, we get messages and we get emails and we get some of the help kind of messages, what do we do? So it's there, and it's, or it's here. It's not there, it's here.
Right.
And we have to be creative with understanding what it's doing to us and what we can do, and then what it can do for us.
Okay. Yeah, no, I love that you mentioned summer, because I feel like the summer vacation ruined all the rules, like we're out the window, ruined all the routines. I mean, sleep schedules were all over the place. The screen time limits were, very loose, very agile.
Yeah.
I mean, it was okay to get an extra hour here or there, but they did lead to tantrums when it wasn't given, because they felt like, okay, well, you agreed yesterday, why not today? And I think that's one of the major things we will be discussing. But I just want to go back to that human connection. How is it affecting that, in your opinion, and as a psychologist as well?
Right, absolutely. This morning I met a bunch of parents. We were all kind of, like I said, happily handing our children to school. And we were talking about tech, and some said that, and this is the beauty of the awareness around what we're discussing, right? And it's shows like this that really help to contribute to that awareness and that information, and to filter it down to the important bits, because there's a lot of stuff out there that is, I want to say it's sort of, they're claims but not really verified. Yeah. And some said, we just said we forgot the iPad. And I said, really? Did your kids buy that? Because I don't know if mine won't buy it. And they said, yeah, we actually just took that decision to experiment and say, can you believe it? We forgot it. And I said, and how did you do? Great. And others said, yeah, it was on the weekend. And some said it was a nightmare. So we really had the whole range. We had the whole range of that tech experience over the summer. But I do think that this awareness around regulating and balancing is coming through to parents and schools now, because it's been around long enough, and now we have studies and we've seen the actual effects in human interaction and human connection. Right. So we know from some of the studies that just having a phone on the table, even if it's on silent and even if it's turned over, so sort of face down, affects the quality and quantity of communication.
Interesting.
So we think, well, it's there, I'm not really looking at it, but just the presence of that thing on the table subconsciously affects, it's almost like there's something else, right? And so our children have been born seeing parents holding a phone.
Yes.
We didn't have that growing up.
Yeah.
Somewhere along the line, maybe in the teens, we might have seen our parents on computers, and that was a distraction to the parenting relationship. But even if you got on a computer like 40 years ago, well, no, I've got my timelines right, maybe 35 years ago, there just wasn't so much to do, right? So you kind of finished what you had to do, and then, as is the case with all human evolution, something comes up and it's disruptive, right? Even if it was TV, and then we had the internet, right? But I was reading about sort of historically, just going back, even the wheel, and how there was anxiety around the invention of the wheel. Really? It's probably a parent who started that.
Who started that? Yeah,
said,
exactly.
I wonder what harm they can do with this. What's dangerous about this wheel? Yeah. But then we adapted. And I think that's where we are right now. We're at the point where we really, really need to adapt. And we need to figure out what's working. And I think this is the biggest dichotomy, right? Regulating takes self-control, which is directed by the prefrontal cortex. And that's exactly what some of the research has found, that excessive technology use is thinning the cortex. So we talk about it as an addiction and an addictive behavior, and that's exactly what it starts to look like, because there's no regulation, there's no long-term thinking. It's just in the moment. The biochemistry is changing. The dopamine hit is real. It's measured. Lots of studies have replicated this, and that's kind of creating a kind of it's creating a kind of competition, right? So I get all this excitement from being on social media and checking all my likes and all these alerts and things that are just binging away. No 5 seconds are the same anymore.
Right.
And so why would I then want to go through reading a whole book? And this is the young person's perspective, right? And that's the competition. So helping them kind of say, well, guess what? It's not me, but the neuroscientists. They scan brains. And they found that there's actually changes to your brains and your biochemistry and how you access the critical thinking parts of your brain that's changing. So we're not saying don't use it at all, but we're saying how can we use it for us? In a way that works.
Regulating, I feel like, is the key word that you mentioned. I mean, it's all about controlling those urges. It's like those, any other habit. It's like smoking. It's like obsessive eating. It's about control. And I feel like that's what tech has become, I mean, based on exactly what you were just mentioning. But can you tell us, what are some of the consequences of that, of the thinning of the cortex? You mentioned that. So what can that lead to?
Yeah, well, the biggest risk is it affects decision making and critical thinking. So in a way, you're more susceptible. Anything that you're consuming online becomes real, right? And that ability to just kind of differentiate and say, is that real? Is that imagined? So we teach our children in the digital literacy bits about how do you know that's true and how do you know that's not true? And one of the ways that we do it is we'll actually make, using AI, videos and say, that video looks real, but guess what? It's not.
I love that you use technology for your benefit and for teaching purposes, and that's what we were talking about, is knowing when to use it and actually to use it for positive outcomes rather than just wasting time, 2 hours at a time of just scrolling through whatever social media platform, not to mention anything specific. But it also goes back to the children's attention span. I know my niece, can literally go through 50 videos in the span of 2 minutes because she gets bored easily. So if a video is longer than 30 seconds, she'll scroll up. She'll keep scrolling. And it's funny that you mentioned your daughter as well, because my older niece actually started learning about ChatGPT. So she was like, I can always ask ChatGPT to see if it's true or not. And she verifies whatever she wants through that. And I found that shocking. Wow. She's only 10. Yeah. I was like, I only knew about that last year. And, and how to use it.
Well, ChatGPT just came out.
I know.
It feels like it just came out.
I know.
And we're still figuring out how to use prompts and how to make the prompts, you have to use intelligent prompts. And so she's definitely ahead of it.
Yeah. And that's the path that they're going in. And that's how tech is, it's massively integrated in their daily lives. In school. And that's the next question is, a lot of these kids in schools are using iPads. It's a prerequisite now that they have an iPad, because a lot of the lessons or notes or presentations or projects are done on these iPads. So it is a prerequisite. So how do you create that balance when they're back at home? They're in front of screens from the moment that they wake up and they enter school until they come back from school. So how do you control it back in the home?
Yeah. Well, I think most schools are recognizing, we definitely have a policy that we've been working on, to guide the use of technology in school. Right. So there's different criteria. So is the technology a substitution for something that is valuable? So an example would be using Word versus paper and pencil.
Right.
So that weighing that with every decision that a teacher is making vis-a-vis technology versus traditional learning, and asking that question. So the first one is substitution. Is this a substitution that is in a way necessary, right? And can you, as an educator or even as a parent, think of whether this substitution has greater value, or is it maybe just more convenient, but it's actually better to use the paper and pencil, right? Because we know from different studies as well that learning how to write and formulate words and letters is a different brain process, and we need to stick to that, right? Otherwise, we're just losing a whole part of our brain and not using it. So substitution is important, or even augmentation. So that's one of the second criteria. Is this enhancing the students' learning and the teachers' teaching in a way that is substantial, right? That has some kind of evidence to it. So not because I'm tired or I'm feeling lazy. I mean, everyone has those days. But am I really augmenting and enhancing this child's education by using technology for this particular task?
Right. How can parents, put in some practical exercises or, solutions at home to control it so that it doesn't affect their kids to that extent?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
That's a
I know
tough
as
one.
a parent as well. I mean, that's something that you have to think about.
It is, because you're competing with that chemical change, which is the dopamine hit that they're getting from the fun and excitement of having all of this sort of stimulation all at once, right? So, I mean, it's tempting sometimes, and the impulse can be to just take it away and just kind of, sort of deal with it, right? Yeah. But I think we're beyond that. I think now it needs to be, we know that even children will choose an activity of higher value if they experience higher value from it, right? So when you have a child who's kind of, developmentally moving on to the next stage, you don't just take the teddy away and say you're too old for this teddy as a transitional object. It's time to read the books and do the puzzles, and that. Ideally, what we should be doing is we present the toys and the tools for the next developmental phase, allow them to experience both, and then they will naturally spend less time with Teddy. Teddy's around, but spend less time with Teddy because they've moved on to the next task of value, right?
I like that.
So there's a developmental process as well, but if you just took Teddy away, there's a void and there's a crisis, right? So I think with technology now, we're kind of at that stage now where we're saying, well, how do we go back in a way to basics, right? And parents and teachers say, well, but the children say that's so boring now.
Yeah.
And that's because of the dopamine hit that they're not getting, the dopamine rush. And it's about bringing that to their awareness to say, look, it's really exciting to go on a roller coaster every day, or, eat an ice cream and do all this stuff. But what would happen if we did it every day? And in the same way, this is what would happen if we relied on technology for all entertainment and everything else that went along with it.
Right.
So it's a bit of retraining and going back to basics. So we just started playing chess. And really, like, I was sitting there with my fingers crossed going, I hope I see excitement and thinking and kind of that interest that I know I'd see if, they were playing sort of something on the iPad, right? We have a lot of games on the iPad, the educational games that the kids play, and some of them are just mindless as well, right? I mean, there's a whole range. And they did. And so for me, that was I didn't even discuss tech when we were in the chess class. It wasn't like, oh, you need to play less chess, play more chess and be on tech less. It was just about trying to provide them with something that takes consistent effort, and then remind them that that's actually using your brain and strengthening your left and right hemisphere a lot more than passive technology use and passive consumption.
Right.
And that's not easy for children to understand.
No,
there's
it is
plenty
not.
of research that shows that even adults struggle with it.
Yes.
Maybe even more, because as an adult, you don't have someone else coming in there and saying, hey, that's too much. You set your boundaries. And when you set your boundaries, sometimes you're just not as good as you need to be when you can do it for somebody else, right?
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I think it's about just being creative, but doing things that go back to basics, right? And seeing if they experience the little joys in that, and then try to make that consistent, try to make rituals out of it. And also then at the end of the day, it's just about being firm about the boundaries, right? So 30 minutes 3 times a week and we're done, right? I'm not saying that's what it should be, but that's an example of, well, that's done, and now what else can we do?